Thank you for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here with Barbara and James, and it's wonderful because we have a representation of tech, manufacturing, industrial sector, maybe in general, and then we have a representation from more retail, consumer product goods as well. So this maybe not the tech workers that Joe is talking about, the Silicon Valley, although Joe, you did such a nice job framing the issue and inequality and Silicon Valley's contribution to it. What I would love to have us frame our discussion around is, well, we just saw the jobs report that just came out, and it seems like we don't have a problem with the number of jobs. 3.5% unemployment, it's something like lowest in 50 years is what I read, I think, this morning. But we do have a problem with the quality of jobs. And the last I checked from Bureau of Labor Statistics, 47 million Americans worked in jobs where the median wage is less than $15 an hour. That's more than 30% of our workforce that works in jobs where the median wage is less than $15 an hour. And obviously there are lots of contributors to this problem. Automation, globalization, weakening of unions, the weakening of the social contract. But I would love to start with the hardest question first, in case some people decide to leave early.
Oh, they won't.
Which is, if we have to raise wages for the bottom, which is such a huge issue, what would it take?
Fantastic question to start with, but I am going to set the stage a little bit just for those of you who aren't familiar with Siemens. Siemens is, in fact, a player in industrial revolutions, from the first to the current. In 1847, Werner von Siemens started his company. He was involved in communications and power generation, and much of that legacy continues on today. It's a company that innovates, and its long-term strategy, our long-term strategy, is built around global megatrends: climate change, aging demographics, urbanization, the ever more global supply chain, and overarching all of that, digitalization. If you think about these inexorable forces, I mean, how about that? Building a business strategy around things that simply can't be stopped. It's a great strategy. And what we do is we bring our know-how in electrification, in automation, in digitalization, to bring that know-how to solve these problems. Now, what that means is we are a huge job creator. Right now, 380,000 people around the globe. And here in the US, we've been here 160 years, $23 billion worth of revenue, and $5 billion in exports to the rest of the world. I wanted everybody to have that context as we talk today, that perspective. What a lot of people don't know.
And 50,000 jobs in the United States.
50,000 jobs, okay, growing to about 55,000 in this last year or so. And I'll tell you about the shift we're going through, and I think this is relevant for this whole question of what do we do to create good jobs. In 1977, Siemens connected its first turbine remotely. There was not the technology in order to be able to do real-time off-site maintenance, preventive diagnostics. But Siemens could see that future, and they used what tools they had to do what they could. It wasn't until 2007 when we get all the technology of the iPhone, et cetera, that makes it possible now for us to be working remotely and connected everywhere. But starting in 2007, Siemens started buying software assets. And we're now the largest industrial software company in the world. Why is this important? What's happening all around us, this digitalization that's going on, exactly the Silicon Valley techniques that you've seen in communications and entertainment and everything are now coming to the physical world around you. And this know-how in the operational technology of the real world and the virtual technology, the information technology becoming operational technology, bringing this together, closing that loop, this is where the magic is going to happen. Now, what do we need to be focused on to create great jobs for the future? We believe at Siemens that technology can elevate the role of the human. What we're seeing is that we can expand what's humanly possible, and that what we need to do is bring people into the skill sets that are going to allow them to participate in that way. What we're doing is bringing technology to the forefront that has a more intuitive user interface. So a 17-year-old girl in Huntsville, Alabama, can use our engineering tools to design a prosthetic for a Marine who lost his leg in Afghanistan, who wants to be able to snowboard. She can use our design tools because generations of engineering know-how have been encapsulated into the tool set. And now she's able, with a point and click and an intuitive interface, able to make that design and give Kendall that new leg. Now, I'll pause here because this is my very favorite topic. The key thing is using enabling technologies that do elevate the role of people in the work to be done. We believe that's a critical component of a really bright future for all of us.
Yep, and we'll talk about the technology and technology workers. There are 4.4 million people, I think, who work in the technology field, according to last numbers. Around 9 million people who work in manufacturing, and 42 million who work in places like fast food stores or retail stores or home health aides. James, you've had some exposure to these types of industries. What do you think it will take for those industries to rise up and start paying living wages to their employees?
Yeah, I'd make a couple comments. I'm coming to this conversation as a former CEO of a public company in the restaurant space. There's almost 4 million fast food workers. I've spent a bit of time in the retail world with Safeway stores and sit on a regional retailer board. And if you think of retail in total, there's 15 to 16 million employees there. And if you think about the transportation that supports all of those, there's another 10 million workers that are being impacted by this transition to the digital economy. So I think we've got to reimagine what work looks like going forward. The best companies are starting to make bets and investments on how to redesign jobs and how to reimagine a future where there is going to be a combination of technology enabling workers to do better work. Target stores is an example, making significant investments around their employee base and kind of developing their workforce for the future. You've got both Starbucks and McDonald's that are making significant investments, and that's all about engaging their workforces and really creating loyalty on a go-forward basis for their employee bases, and I'll stop there.
So you're both seeing technology as an enabler in terms of being able to create more good jobs in different sectors. And interestingly, MIT just came out with a new report about future of work and the role of technology. And the big message, one of the big messages was that we don't have to worry about the number of jobs, we have to worry about the quality of jobs. And then the other one was we need to focus on good technologies that raise productivity and that raise customer service. The danger is having some of those so-so technologies that don't necessarily raise productivity or the value that you provide to customers. That's an issue, but I'm glad to see.
I'd like to finish off the point separately because I think the technology is both an opportunity, but it is a threat. So the 10 million jobs in transportation and trucking will potentially displace workers. I think the more thoughtful organizations, governments, and companies will see that a decade from now we're going to have autonomous vehicles leveraged across all the long-haul transportation in both the retail and restaurant sectors. You've got self-checkout, digital menu boards. All those are impacting the workforce. What can't be replicated is the customer service work and the communication skills that human beings bring to the table. And I think the most thoughtful leaders and companies and municipalities will prepare for that inevitability.
Yeah,
but there is a potential risk for many, many human beings to be displaced. And the mayor yesterday from Little Rock talked about, kind of the gap between the folks on the wrong side of the track in his community not being connected with these jobs, with the future jobs that were being created in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I think that's an important problem for us all to think about.
Yep. one of the things that I would love us to talk about is this something that's on everybody's mind, the stakeholder view of the world versus the shareholder view of the world, and maybe we have come too far in focusing on maximizing shareholder value only. Business Roundtable obviously came up with a new release a couple months ago saying that we should take into account all the stakeholders. But I would love to hear your take on how did we get here? Like, how did we get to a place where taking care of employees, taking care of our communities, or even customers in some cases, are not things that we talk about or we emphasize, and the focus is so much on just profit maximization, and not for the long term necessarily, but for the short term. So how did we get here?
I think the best leaders and the best companies have always focused on a broader stakeholder view. I mean, for me personally, as CEO, and maybe it's because of how I came to that job. So I'm a unlikely person to be sitting here as CEO, board member. As the mayor talked about yesterday, I'm somebody who was from the wrong side of the tracks in St. Louis, Missouri. So, you know, from me coming from that very humble beginning, I always thought about the human capability and brought a lot of empathy to the CEO job. And the best CEOs, I'd argue, have always done that. If I look at Starbucks as a great example, Howard Schultz, for very similar reasons, has always thought about his employees and the communities that they do business in as an important part of how he ran that company. And there are many, many other companies, but my view is, you know, without a sincere focus on the culture and the workforce, almost nothing else matters from a pure leadership perspective. And then the communities that you do business in become important kind of feeders to the culture and the livelihood of any company or business. I mean, that's my personal view.
CEOs are, I mean, my corporate hero, favorite CEO is Jim Sinegal. He retired now, the founder of Costco, and Costco now pays $23 an hour for their workers in the retail space. But those CEOs who focus on integrity and being able to create great value for their shareholders in the long term and doing it right seems to be so few in number. Just by looking at the numbers alone, right? There are fewer CEOs like Jim Sinegal and more CEOs who would rather pay maybe as little as possible to their workers. So how did we get here?
I think there are more than we realize, and there are probably a lot of those unsung heroes in our business environment today. I'm really proud to be on the board of Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, and Daryl Brewster's here in the audience. The work that group has been doing over the last 20 years, and the focus now, you know, I'll just use that simple old phrase: what gets measured gets done. What do we talk about all the time? What do we talk about all the time? Who do we revere? Who are our heroes? Turns out a whole lot of what's been revered over these last few decades has been how many billions are in the bank for the CEO, right? It's been a lot about just shareholder value, those things that are easy to measure, easy to report on. And so the work of groups like CECP is really great in terms of helping people understand the causal relationship, or at least the correlation, between the holistic stakeholder management and the financial returns to shareholders. And we can see that companies who are doing the right things for all of their stakeholders actually are thriving.
I agree, but I will say the median retail wage is $11.33. Costco's is $23. So clearly, most companies are not doing this, right?
Yeah.
So that's the, like, I know there are more examples, but like, why is it that maybe I get.
This is good. You're passionate about this.
Yes, and
yeah.
I would love, you know, what like,
Hey, do you think it's
it?
boards, James?
Well, for me, I think it has to.
I'll continue asking why. You answer me.
I think it has to start in the boardroom. That's where the policies get made, and that's where we're starting to see boards spend a lot more time around people and culture and living wages and sustainability. At least the best boards are spending a lot more time there. I think I mean, it's a challenge. You've got some of these businesses that systemically can't pay the $23 that Costco pays. I mean, based on their respective business models, and you're seeing many of those companies, especially in the retail space, the convergence of the technology disruption and the inability to be competitive from a consumer offering perspective is running many retailers out of business, and it's a challenge. And I think the companies with better business models and a better value proposition to both the consumer and the worker, you're going to see those companies thrive moving forward. And you're seeing big retailers starting to pivot, looking at those
It takes a lot of operational excellence and creating
Absolutely.
value for the customer that enables you to pay high wages to your employees. But you made this great point about boards and CEO pay. And that is something that's also being talked about so much, right? We've come to a place where last year, I think the CEO to worker ratio was 287, quite high compared to what it used to be way before. So what's your view on how we got here? There are some CEOs that make more than 1,000 times their workers. So do we solve this problem in the boardroom, as you alluded to, or what do you think, or is it even a problem?
Barb?
Oh, thanks, James. Hey, well,
Don't worry. If you don't
I'll
answer,
come back.
So let me share a couple of thoughts. I know we're going to get into a dynamic dialogue about many of these things, and I've told Zainab, hey, nothing's off limits, right? We ought to talk openly about these things. But so let's just talk about the dynamic on pay. Do you want to attract and retain the very best is the argument that you'll often hear. I want to attract and retain the very best. And I think one of the key values, in running a successful operation is the retention of a key leader who's effective and has proven to deliver results. And so you see this sort of ratcheting up of, on boards, people saying, I need to get the star CEO. I need to keep the star CEO. What's it going to take? Well, here's the question I'm going to ask you all. How much is my performance worth? And what I'll share with you is I think I'm priceless. I mean, it's that simple, right? So how are we going to have free market forces operating on that question of how much am I worth? I think boards then have to make those decisions. What kind of dynamic do we want to set up between our leaders and the people who work across our organization? At Siemens, what we've chosen to do is to actually focus more on an ownership culture. At Siemens, what we're doing is, and I shared this with a few people at dinner last night, this remarkable statistic, 380,000 employees worldwide, 300,000 of them are share owners. Now, what's fascinating is we actually offered shares for free at a certain point, and not everyone took us up on it. So I was having a hard time kind of understanding that concept. Who would work for us who would prefer not to own shares in the company? But this whole idea of trying to drive employee engagement in order to drive the effective business models that are going to yield value to our customers and bring value to society, right? This is the equation that needs to be worked out in each one of these businesses within their markets. All right, did I dodge that okay?
You were perfect.
Okay, thanks.
And I might, frame it slightly differently. This is about building great environments for all people to work in. So I wouldn't focus as much on the CEO to average worker compensation. The best companies are focused inside the company, designing jobs and organizations that have culture, that have a high degree of respect for being more inclusive and including folks and engaging them in the right kind of work and having equitable pay at all levels of the organization and investing in opportunities for me to grow as an associate inside the company with a path to grow and create value for myself and my family. And I think that's where more of the time needs to be spent, and you're starting to see that in boardrooms and companies as they focus on this whole idea around purpose and culture. And there's a lot more discussion around leveraging culture with a filter on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The best companies are starting to really accelerate and separate themselves from that vantage point.
Do you see any opportunity to disclose some of these metrics so that outside either investors or even customers could have a better understanding of which firms are the ones who are truly engaging their employees? I mean, if engagement, motivation, if these are truly important things, which I think we all agree that they are, it would be useful for the investors to have a sense of the level of engagement. So what's your view on companies disclosing their human capital metrics, just like how they're disclosing their environmental, and governance type of metrics now?
Yeah.
Yep.
May I?
Sure.
Well, I'll share the story of at Siemens. But one of the things that our global CEO did at a shareholders meeting a couple years ago was share with the audience that we're investing 600 million euros a year on employee training. And he actually got a question from a shareholder, why are you wasting our money? And he had that moment. This is Joe Kaeser. Those of you who may not be familiar with Siemens leadership, Joe Kaeser paused and then said what was truly on his mind. Owning stock in Siemens is not a prison. You can make your own decisions about whether you believe this is a wise investment. This is what we are choosing to do. So, sorry. With that,
yeah, and the point I'd make around disclosures, if you've got many companies that are starting to make more disclosures. I sit on the board of a public company in the education and learning workforce solution area, Adtalem Global Education, and we're starting to report many of the metrics around our human capital because we think that's central to what we do as an organization. And I think more disclosure from that perspective will at least give investors a window into what matters inside companies, how they're retaining their employee base, and what the implications might be moving forward. But more disclosures, I think, is a very positive
Yeah,
thing.
I agree with you on this. And we have a lot of voluntary disclosure going on. So back to CECP, this whole idea of, gathering together a room full of investors and then allowing CEOs to take the stage and talk about their own long-term plans, entertain questions from the audience, and get challenged on, are they on the right path? First of all, just pulling together the material that describes your long-term plan, that's powerful in and of itself. And then to go through that sort of public vetting and testing, it's the quarterly return, it's the quarterly shareholder meeting, but and the sort of the reporting to the street on steroids, and taking that long-term view so that you're able to then come back and ask, what am I doing in the moment that is contributing to that long-term vision?
And you mentioned $600 million in training?
Yes.
600? Okay, so what kind of incentives did Siemens have for that type of investment?
No, so this is great, right? What we've been really focused on here in the US is to actually have this conversation. Why is it that we can get tax incentives for things like property, plant, and equipment, and yet when we make those same investments in our human resources, and I don't even want to say human capital, it's not human capital, it's talent. When we are not being incentivized to make investments in the people who build these businesses, what's wrong with our system? It's actually incentivizing us to do the wrong thing.
So
am I as passionate as you are?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think this is so amazing that we can invest in robots and get a tax credit for it, and invest in our humans and get nothing.
Yeah. Yes.
So what would you recommend, like, for those who are in the policy world?
We are actively recommending this. I'm today serving on the American Workforce Policy Advisory Board. Secretary Ross at the Department of Commerce has actually prompted this dialogue amongst our group, and asking the question of, what would you recommend? Now, we've gone to the SEC, we've gone to FASB. Of course, changing accounting rules is a long and involved process. And of course, then what we'd like to do is raise our voice as advocates for this. We'd like for others who are lobbyists to sort of pick up the mantle and help make the case that this is a change that's possible and it's a change that would change behaviors.
And one very specific example from my background, just the Job Corps. So this is something that is in place that most folks don't even think about it, but I mean, it's an apprenticeship kind of craft program. It's all over the U.S. If that work was revamped, for this next century, I think you'd find lots of the challenges that we're going to have in the labor force could be answered with retraining, reskilling, as you're taking the most disadvantaged in our population and putting them through meaningful programs that prepared them for the future. The specific example at Jamba, we tapped into the Job Corps culinary program. So they happen to have a culinary center in the Bay Area, which is where we were headquartered at the time, and we would bring a pipeline of those young people through our shops that created jobs moving forward. If you could envision, and I think there's something like 120 of these centers across the country, concerted effort and thought around how to revamp that for this next century that we're headed towards. I think you'd be able to build some momentum on a scaled basis.
Barbara, would you comment on the apprenticeship program too? Because I believe Siemens has done great work in this area.
We have, and I'm proud to share the story of what we've done. You know that Siemens, its headquarters is in Germany, and so the German apprenticeship model is incredibly powerful. But think about a country where the government can help establish national standards for skills that are needed within critical industries, and then an academic system that will, in lockstep, then make sure that the curriculum develops those skills within its student body. And then think about an industry sector that will make the commitments to bring those people on board. So literally thousands of apprentices have come through the Siemens programs, and in fact 3 members of our managing board, they've risen to the highest levels, began as apprentices at Siemens. Now, we actually had a moment in the US, it was 11 years ago, before my time in my current role, when we were expanding our gas and steam turbine production plant in Charlotte, North Carolina. We call it our energy hub. We needed to hire 1,200 people. We had 12,000 applicants, but could not find enough qualified applicants to fill the jobs. So the answer was to create something like a German apprenticeship model with an American accent. What we did is we went to Central Piedmont Community College and got the community college engaged in developing a mechatronics course. We then developed this apprenticeship pipeline. So imagine kids coming out of high school, or veterans coming out of the military, people coming in mid-career, applying for these apprenticeships, going through the academic program, which we pay for, being paid for the work they're doing while they are apprentices in a special area of the shop where they're learning to prove their skills and capabilities, and then exiting that program and basically no debt and a well-paying job. I was just there last week because Good Morning America reached out and asked to do a segment. They're taping some stories like this that they'll be featuring. And so I was down in the shop. We had one of our apprentices is 7 months pregnant. She shared that she had come to Siemens partly because of our fantastic work-life balance programs, but her dad was a machinist. She had seen how valuable, how rewarding this could be, and so she had entered the program. Some of our graduates have gone on to enter 4-year programs and become engineers, designers. They're playing key roles within the plant. So, these are the stories that help illustrate the kind of change that can happen. How do you take it to scale? I actually think one of the things I have to do differently now is to think less about what's happening nationally. Yeah, 50,000 employees and jobs growing. What I want to do is empower leaders in the local areas where we have the greatest presence, the greatest set of customers, the greatest ecosystem of suppliers. Because the real question is, how can you take someone who perhaps isn't ready for that future, put them through a series of experiences and jobs that get them ready for the future, and create a talent pipeline within a geographic location? I think there's a lot that's going to happen on the local level, and it's going to take forming those partnerships locally to empower it.
And I guess one final point here, if I could advocate a point to both the policymakers and academicians sitting in the room, is to, I mean, if we take this Siemens example of apprenticeship and you multiply that times 1,000, and you had leaders thinking creatively about how to shift this workforce and prepare it to make it more competitive for the future, I'd argue that apprenticeships and some versions of an apprenticeship program in many, many industries would do a couple things. It would create more capable employees, it would create loyalty, it would reduce some of the debt related to education today, and it would create much stronger companies and much stronger communities.
And who knows, if you have this model going all the way up, I mean, I look at companies like UPS or Costco who has a culture of internal promotion, people moving from the front lines to all the way to the top. Maybe we don't need that 287 to 1 CEO to worker ratio either, because we will have plenty of talent to move on to that.
Sure.
So with that, let's open it up to questions. I think we have lots of questions from the audience. Yes.
One of the things that I think upsets American workers rightly is I need one though, then Jonah, we always come back to training. But the American workforce has never been better educated, more trained, and capable of being retrained. And we can all support continuing to do that. But what about distribution? And what it would be great to hear from you two business leaders is, how do you feel about worker voice within the corporation? Where are you on restoring the ability of people to form unions and to, in good faith, be recognized as bargaining agents? And it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on that, because part of it is a shift in distribution of corporate earnings, and not just away from the folks at the bottom, but from, frankly, very skilled middle management and science workers as well, because their wages have stagnated while people at the top. So it'd be very interesting to hear where you are on worker voice and leverage within corporate America.
Yeah, for me, I'd start. I mean, I chair the board of Fair Trade USA. So we're focused on workers' rights. That's the nonprofit. It's a nonprofit, global, squarely focused on workers' rights, workers having a voice, eliminating global poverty. I'd give just one example that is going to happen in the U.S. around the work that we're doing. Shivani has started to partner with Fair Trade USA, and they're going to launch a program that will start to transform the dairy industry. The program will launch in 2020. But there are other, examples of where fair trade is prevalent throughout the supply chains of companies, and I'd give Patagonia is maybe one of the best examples. 70% of all their products would have the fair trade label. Is just a fantastic example. I also sit on the board of a retailer, so we obviously have unions. I sit on the board of Snook Supermarkets in St. Louis, and we've just settled a recent agreement with the union for multiple years. But I also sit in other industries with the work that I do, and I agree with you. There is some retraining that needs to happen, but the best companies are making real and material investments in their workforces.
Do you think there should be more worker voice?
I think where it makes sense. I think depending on the, in cooperatives and, some of those kinds of industries, I think you definitely need more worker voice. And I think there's various ways of getting that input into the C-suite and boardroom.
Yes. Oh, yes. On the top, I had seen your hand. on the list. Okay, maybe you choose.
Thank you. First, a word about Siemens. My sister-in-law, who has a master's in psychology and is completely bilingual, worked for Siemens for 20 years. She did intercultural training. She went to Siemens customers. She went to Siemens people to tell them about what to expect from their customers or how to work with a joint manufacturer. And she was laid off. In fact, her whole division, whatever it was called, in Germany, was laid off. And she was protected by the German laws to some extent. But this is a woman who has 20 years of experience at Siemens, speaks 3 languages, can do all kinds of things. She now consults in training. And I understand in Germany, someone who's 50 years old can't get another job. So she's scraping along. So that's Siemens. Amazon, very successful company, right? Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world. Have you read about what goes on in Amazon warehouses? And the fact that many of those people don't work for Amazon. They work for contractors. So when something happens, the workers are screwed. Now don't tell me about how big, successful companies care for their workers. This contracting out, off-sourcing, trucking. Those used to be good jobs. You work for a trucking company. Now it's all contracted out. The trucker buys the truck, pays for the gas, does all the work. Something happens. Company has no responsibility for anything. Those are terrible jobs. They all have to be automated.
Thank you for speaking up. Isn't this amazing, right? That we are corporations and we employ literally hundreds of thousands of people, and we are constantly in a state of change. And every single change impacts individuals. And yes, I know, right? We've got numerous cases of folks, maybe it'll be me next, right? Who, as the corporation changes, we say, hey, the role that I'm playing is no longer necessary. And so those kinds of changes happen. And so starting to think about careers as a continuum, starting to think about what happens as a next step and the step after that, right? This is the way we have to think today. And employees don't belong to a company. I've been actually a little bit worried about this reverse topic, which is maybe where we're headed is what I refer to as me incorporated, right? All of us as free agents managing our careers. And then the question is, what tools does a corporation have to retain the great talent and get the right talent engaged at the right time when it is important for us to have that talent on board? And then how can we make it graceful for people when we say, okay, we've accomplished our objective, it's time to move on, and an individual can say, okay, now here's the next constructive step I can take in my career. Yes, Germany has a lot of social infrastructure that's quite different from what we have here in the US. What I'm encouraging our employees in the US to think long and hard about is a career that lasts 50 years. Not 25 and a gold watch, not 30 in retirement, but 50 years or longer. And what would you do differently? How would you be?
Not everyone is an entrepreneur.
Yes, not everyone is an entrepreneur. But thank you for sharing the stories.
People are not one use and dispose.
Yes, maybe we'll take the next question. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for this. My name is Sarah Prey. I work for the Open Society Foundation. It's delighted to be here. I wanted to ask a specific question about co-determination, since we've talked a little bit about worker voice and a lot about Germany, so it seems relevant. So this idea of employees sitting on the boards as a way of guaranteeing that employee voice. Obviously very popular elsewhere, hasn't so much caught on here in the US. Wanted to ask specifically if you see co-determination as one important tool in order to address a lot of these issues we're talking about.
Are you running into any of that in the various boards and groups that you work with?
No, not much.
Not much. It's coming. But let's think about other ways. Let's think about other ways that some things we are doing. So in the U.S. for Siemens, I shared with you, we've got this 2050 strategy. Building our corporate strategy around what's going to happen over the next 30 years. I asked a different question in the U.S. What does the U.S. market hold for Siemens in the next 10 years? And then what do we need to be doing today in order to achieve what needs to, optimize our performance, if you will? What I chose to do is bring together employees from across the corporation, from various roles within the corporation, functions, businesses, et cetera. And we actually put them onto teams looking at specific areas, the future of mobility, the future of energy, the future of infrastructure, and got their input. It gave them access to anybody in the corporation or any of our advisors outside. And lo and behold, after a couple months study, they came back to management, to the executive team, what we just call it the US leadership team. And they are members of that leadership team now, talking to us about what are the strategies we should be pursuing in the US. I think there are lots of ways to drive that kind of engagement that is going to be important for driving the future of the company.
Yes.
There's a microphone coming down to you.
Thank you. I'm Pat Malloy. I'm just a trade lawyer. But my understanding, and again, I think the question raised up there, in Germany, labor unions are on corporate boards, I understand. Is Siemens USA, do you have a board and do you have labor unions on it? That's one question. Secondly, I've understood that one way the shareholders have captured management to work on their behalf is by paying management by shares of the stock rather than other ways, so that the managers then get interested in rewarding shareholder value rather than perhaps looking after the broader constituency. Can you deal with both of those questions?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, Siemens does have worker representation on the supervisory board, the governance board for the corporation globally. Here in the US, we have a very lean board structure simply because we are, in fact, a subsidiary of the global corporation. So there's not really that question of representation. We are, following our fiduciary responsibility here. But yeah.
But one of the things that I would love to pick up, and I think we need to close in a few minutes, is the management compensation tied to the value of the firm, which drives many of the decisions. And I feel in my interactions with a lot of large companies, public companies, managers either have the fear that part of it, they have the fear that activists might come after them and fear that they might be fired. But then the other is that their compensation might be reduced if the share, so they end up doing short-term things. Do you see this? And you engage in lots of boards. James, you mentioned, is the fear there? And then is also the fact that your compensation is tied to the value of the firm is a driver of some of the problems that we have.
Discussion, the best companies are going to compensate their executives using a more balanced scorecard that would be considerate of all the stakeholder groups, including the health and well-being of their associates and employees, the impact they have on the planet from a sustainability perspective. So a more contemporary view of compensating an executive is going to be a balanced scorecard that includes certainly financial measurements and creating financial value, but also good stewardship of all the assets and the impacts that CEOs have.
So we just have to lift up those number of companies who have this type of good leadership, is what I'm hearing, right? I mean,
yeah, I think that's the purpose of this discussion that
good
we're having.
leadership, yeah, and it's. I think we're supposed to end at 11:30, but just a very quick way. But what would it take from the leaders? And maybe it will take more courage and commitment for our leaders to be to take care of their workers and feel that it's important to take care of their workers. Perhaps some compassion too. I remember several years ago, Mark Bartoloni, who was the CEO of Aetna at the time, when he found out that his call center workers were not making ends meet, even the ones who worked there for full time, they were not able to afford the healthcare benefits. They just couldn't take care of their families. And when he found out, and the thing is, many CEOs don't know this, When he found out, he did a simple calculation. He said, what would it take for us to pay living wages to our call center workers? And they did the calculation, and they figured it's actually not a huge part of our profit, and we can do the right thing. And they raised the wages to $17 an hour. This is several years ago. And I think in some businesses, doing the right thing is actually quite simple, because the lowest waged workers are not a huge chunk of your profits. But then there are some sectors where most people with low wages work, like retail, like fast food. In those environments, lifting up wages to $15, $17 would bankrupt some of the companies. These are companies where the labor costs are the biggest share of their costs, and these companies have single-digit profit margins. So in those environments, courage and commitment and compassion is not enough. We need more companies like Costco, which has great operational excellence and commitment to good management practices, and they create an environment where they can pay their workers $23 an hour. I think we need a lot more of this courage, commitment, competence from our leaders, because millions of Americans who can't make enough money to take care of their families deserve better. Thank you for being part of this.